Well, we're officially in March 2020, which means it's time to once again look back on the animated films that came out in 2019. Specifically the theatrical ones, of course. This might just be the biggest year that I've had for Animation Explosion. Not just because practically every animation studio played a part in bringing out a movie, but because there's a lot of movies to talk about. 19 is currently the most I've had to talk about. That's almost the entire month. However, that high number in of itself isn't going to stop me from talking about each film that was given to us. Unfortunately, 2019 was also home to probably the most amount of unoriginal animated movies as well. I mean, this year was filled with sequels, adaptations, remakes, rip-offs, etc. I could probably count a good 6 original ideas out of 19. Now yes, the more important discussion is whether or not they were good, but now it seems like every studio is doing the sequelitis trap. There will even be a few movies this month that you probably won't even expect to see me talk about, for better or for worse. But like I said, if it's a theatrical release in any way, shape or form, that counts as a film to be reviewed in this marathon. It's also neat that this year also brought DreamWorks, Laika, Nickelodeon and Blue Sky into the limelight again, seeing as how they didn't even have an animated film last year, some cases not even films in ages. Now keep in mind that I'm going by these films in the order that they were specifically released here in Australia, since I often like to follow my country's own guidelines. Also keep in mind that a lot of these videos will have spoilers, but warnings will be applied in videos that actually have them. So sit back, grab some popcorn, and get yourself comfortable. It's Animation Explosion 2020 edition. So let's start this year off with not the LEGO Movie 2 like everyone else got, but rather the third and final installment of the Dragons franchise, How to Train Your Dragon: The Hidden World. It's interesting to think about why this movie was released almost 2 months earlier in Australia than in the United States. Could it be due to a deal between Universal and the Australian Film Corporation? Or were DreamWorks just nice enough to give Aussies an early muncher, presumably their last good movie for a long time? Anywho, it shouldn't come off as a surprise that I'm a big fan of the Dragons franchise. The first one was a surprisingly spectacular film, and this is coming from someone who's not all familiar with the books. What's crazy is that it took a lot of cliches I usually can't stand and somehow managed to make them work really well. The sequel is one of my favorite DreamWorks films of all time. I love it so much. It took something that worked and multiplied it 10 times more. Which is why it really breaks my heart to admit that, as a finale to one of my favorite franchises of the decade, Hidden World came and went on a somewhat sour note. Now, that's not to say this movie's bad. Far from it, but it suffers one major problem that I feel makes it the worst film in the trilogy. That and a few other minor things as well. It begins shortly after the events of the second film, where the Burkians are welcoming more dragons into their village and Hiccup is getting used to his new role as chief. But when an evil dragon hunter named Grimmel wants to kill Toothless and take the other dragons captive, the Burkians decide to leave the place in order to find a safer place to live. All of which are unaware that Grimmel has sent out a light fury to woo Toothless and tease him enough so he can capture him. Already the plot sounds eerily similar to the conflict in the second movie, in which Drago was using an alpha to control the other dragons and take over Burke. I don't mind a repeated conflict if it had enough twists and turns to make it engaging, but instead it just goes straight down the cliched and predictable route. How to Train Your Dragon 3 definitely feels like the Toy Story 3 of the franchise, and I don't mean that in a very positive way. When it comes to the story as is, it also raises a lot of questions. Why doesn't Grimmel just kill Toothless? If he claims that he's killed every single Night Fury on the planet, then why doesn't he just go right in and kill Toothless instead of just teasing him with a pretty girl dragon that Toothless immediately has the hots for? It'd probably be a lot quicker and would prevent him from getting noticed. His motivations seem pathetically one note as well, as he's only doing this for self-praise and not for a revenge plot or anything that would make sense in context of his goals. And speaking of Toothless, it feels bizarrely out of character that he would immediately fall for the Light Fury the second he sees her. And what makes this element even more baffling is that Toothless only spends about 4 minutes of screen time with her before deciding he wants to leave Hiccup and spend the rest of his life with her. Most evident when he gets his new tail. I know Toothless has been searching for more of his kind for a long time, but think about what he's done in the other 2 movies. He went against nature's intended rules to protect Hiccup and stand proud as alpha of the dragons. It just doesn't seem right that his character would instantly do this in a brief period of time. And this partakes in what is easily the movie's biggest flaw. It feels like its own separate story that tries to throw everything that was achieved in the first two movies out of the window. The first two movies were all about challenging preconceived notions by having an unlikely bond between a Viking and a dragon, and both species have been at each other's throats for generations. Hiccup and Toothless managed to accomplish things that nobody ever could. They killed a queen dragon, and Toothless stood up to the king of dragons in the second film to protect Hiccup. So when you have a finale that contradicts what was learned in the movies that came before it, I begin to question if this movie had any rewrites at all. This series has been all about making Vikings believe that dragons are not actually monsters, but giant cat-like creatures that can be tamed and loved. This point was even proven to Valka in the second movie, where she does learn that humans can change and adapt to dragons despite history's nature intended. I know the dragon riders are supposed to learn to not be so reliant on their dragons, but what does that imply when the same movie has Toothless wanting to leave Hiccup and then all the dragons leaving because of this carbon copy villain from the second movie? And with that said, let's talk about the ending. After the villain is presumably killed, you can't convince me he just drowned right here with no explanation. The Vikings decide that dragons can't live in peace with them as long as many horrible people in the world continue to hunt them down, so the dragons leave towards the hidden world. And I mean every single dragon. At first I wasn't really bothered by the ending. I thought, okay, it makes sense. Not all humans are gonna adapt to dragons, and it makes sense for them to hide until humanity can change. But then I watched this video from a YouTuber known as Toon Ruins, and she mentioned this.
Basically, what was said at the end of the movie was that humans are selfish creatures who will continually exploit and abuse dragons, and that they are incapable of change, which is an idiotic sentiment considering the entirety of Burke changed their views overnight in the first movie.
I literally couldn't sum it up any better. This ending best describes the movie's biggest flaw. I understand that not every dragon is going to easily adapt to humans and vice versa. These two species have been trying to kill one another for generations, but what the hell are the Vikings supposed to learn now once the dragons have disappeared off the planet? Especially since, according to Hiccup, people stopped believing in dragons 10 years after they disappeared. Seems a little contradictory to what was said before, in that dragons and humans don't have to be separated forever. But how are humans supposed to adapt to dragons if they can't see or believe in them? If you want to have the humans being less dependent on the dragons, fine, but that shouldn't equal all the dragons disappearing. Why not have it instead where the dragons leave for a brief while because of mating season, and that Toothless needs to spend a little bit of time away from Hiccup to get the Life Fury to adapt to humans better? And while you're at it, have him be a little reluctant on his relationship with her. Why not show other real world problems like bigger dragons showing up and the dragon riders needing to sort the problem out without their own dragons? I would go further into detail, but that one video explains enough of what I need to, so I'll leave a link in the description if you wish to check it out. And it really sucks what this movie went for, because there's still a lot of good things about it. The animation is still gorgeous, and I'd even argue is the best looking of the Dragons films. The soundtrack is wonderful, most of the characters are still likable and funny, and there are still plenty of action scenes that are exciting and fun. It's just that this didn't feel like the proper way to conclude the How to Train Your Dragon trilogy. Overall though, it is still good, though I say that with some slight hesitation. If this movie did make you emotional, great. If it moved you, great. If you loved this one the most out of all of them, that's wonderful. But I have to speak where my mind is, and I don't think this film felt very appropriate with its franchise's topic on changing the status quo. And it's because of that that I now proclaim the Kung Fu Panda trilogy as DreamWorks' most consistent and well-rounded trilogy. It's certainly not the biggest disappointment DreamWorks has made, but in terms of their franchises, it feels the most out of place with what it was going for. If you enjoy it, that's fine, but I think I'm going to stick with the first two for now.